In this video, I'll show you how I made this curved front display case. I made this for my wife for her to display one of her collector's dolls in. The curved front added a lot of challenges to this project, but in a really fun way. So let's get started.
I start by cutting the top and bottom panels to the exact length of 18 inches and then to a width of about 1/4 inch wider than the tip of the radius of the curve that'll be on one side. These panels have an MDF core, which I thought was necessary to avoid warping and wood movement over time, and they also have an 1/8 inch thick cherry veneer that I made myself. Although I could have just bought some veneer or even bought some pre-made cherry plywood, but I wanted the thicker veneer for this project so I could sand it and work with it a little bit easier. To cut the circular arc on one side of these panels, I'm going to use a circle cutting jig that requires a pivot cookie to be attached at the circle's center point of the workpiece. And then I set the circle cutting jig to the 11 1/4 inch radius that I want the arc to be cut at. This jig works in a two-step process. First is to make a rough cut on the bandsaw. And then to take the jig and the workpiece over to the router table to clean up the edge and get the exact radius using a 1/4 inch straight bit. This multi-step process to cut the arc takes a little bit of time and patience, but the result is a really clean, sharp edge at exactly the radius I'm looking for. So now on to cut the facer boards. I'm ripping them first to width on the table saw, and then cutting them to rough length on the miter saw. I'm wanting to have a continuous grain lengthwise on these pieces around the front and sides of the display case, so with a little bit of planning on how the pieces are cut, then I should be able to get that grain continuity around the front corners of the display case. These longer center pieces will be the curved section across the front of the case. I'll make them curved by using a bent lamination process. And here's a quick shot of the result after converting those straight center pieces to curved. So there's a separate, more detailed video on making these bent lamination pieces, so I'll just include the short 20-second abridged version here. The process involves resawing a piece of wood into thin strips on the bandsaw, and then using my sled on my thickness planer to clean up the surface cut by the bandsaw. And then I glue it all back together using a circular arc form. And note that to make the clamping form, I use the same circle cutting jig on the router table that I just used to cut the curves on the top and bottom panels of the display case. And the result are these curved front facer boards that match up to the top and bottom panels perfectly, and I'm stoked. Before cutting the miters, I need to figure out the angles on these front corners. I'm not sure if there's some magic trick to doing this, but with some head scratching and a lot of adding and subtracting angles, I come up with 18.5 degrees. To cut the side pieces, I just set my miter saw at 18.5 degrees, and that cut's pretty easy. But cutting the curved front pieces is a little more complicated. I decided to use the form from the bent lamination glue up, and at 18.5 degrees on the table saw crosscut sled, I stick it down with double-sided tape. By clamping the curved piece onto that form, then I'm able to make the cut. And that approach worked pretty good. So with all the front miters cut and matching up well, then it's just a matter of using the miter saw for the 45-degree miters on the back corners. Alright, it's time to glue it up. With some painter's tape to help me hold the miter joints to get started, I put some glue on the end grain and let it soak in for about 5 minutes. And then I pull it all together with a strap clamp and add a couple extra clamps on the sides. And I did this twice, once for the top piece and once for the bottom piece. So after the glue is dry, it needs a bit of sanding. I kind of made a mess with the glue. I'm really happy to have the 1/8 inch veneer on these panels, otherwise I'd probably sand through it if it was the really thin veneer. So here's a look at the joints after they're all sanded. Mostly they're pretty true and tight. And the continuous grain around the front corners came out really nice. Even on the edge grain of the bent lamination, it's really even hard to tell that it's a lamination. It just looks like solid wood. I'm a happy camper. So moving on to make the 4 pillars. Just a quick look at the model here in SketchUp. The back pillars are just a simple square cross section, but the front pillars will be a pentagon shape. And there are additional cuts on all of the pillars for the groove for the plexiglass, the offsets to fit around the top and bottom panels, and for the mortises for the cross members. So I've been losing a bit of sleep thinking about how I'm going to cut the pentagon shape for the front pillars and be safe about it. And this is what I came up with. I'll cut it from a piece of 8/4 cherry that I first worked to get all of the faces flat, square, and parallel to each other using a combination of the joiner, planer, and table saw. And I made this little drawing to help guide me through it and keep track of each cut one by one. So the first cut I'm going to make is at 41 degrees, so I set the table saw to that and the work piece on its edge, and I ripped that cut on the table saw. And the second cut is at the same saw setting of 41 degrees, but with the workpiece rotated to lay flat. The third cut is just an easy straight cut at 90 degrees, so I set my table saw back to 90 degrees and make that cut. And the final cut is at 20.5 degrees, so I set the table saw to that and make that final cut. Okay, that was a series of kind of technical cuts and a little more stressful than I normally like to have in the wood shop, but the result is I've got this pentagon shape now that I can use for the front pillars. The back pillars are much easier, just a simple 1-inch square, so 2 rips on the table saw knocks that out pretty quickly. With the use of a stop block on my crosscut sled, I'm able to cut all 4 pillars to the exact same length. Okay, so I can't resist to do an early look at the display case, and since my wife is at work, she doesn't know I'm taking her collector doll to the dusty garage. I get to do a quick test fit, and all is good. Cutting the groove in each pillar for the acrylic plexiglass on the table saw is pretty straightforward. The acrylic is just under 1/8 inch thick, and I have a thin kerf blade, so it takes a couple of passes on the saw. There needs to be an offset or notch cut at the end of each pillar to fit around the facer boards of the display case. By setting up a stop block on the crosscut sled and getting the depth of the blade just right, then I make the cuts on 2 sides and both ends of all 4 pillars with the same setup on the crosscut sled. Okay, one last cut on the pillars before they're complete. It's a little 1/4 inch mortise for the cross members. I set up the router table with a 1/4 inch straight bit and a stop block and cut all of the mortises on both ends of all the pillars. So the pillars are now complete. And just to summarize, there's a slot for the acrylic, the offset or notches to fit around the facer boards, and the mortises for the cross members. Now onto the cross members, which are 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch sticks that'll span between the pillars and also provide the inside edge for the acrylic to fit against. First, to cut a strip of wood 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch on the table saw. And then I cut all the cross members to length using the crosscut sled. And then I also used the crosscut sled to cut the tenons on 3 sides of both ends of all the cross members. And that's a lot of cuts. Not all of them made it into the video, but you get the point. So all of the pieces are cut now, and it's just a matter of some sanding to get them all ready to finish. I'm using a combination of 2 colors of dye to get the color I'm looking for, and mixed with a 50-50 mixture of shellac and denatured alcohol. It's pretty rare for me to do the finish before final assembly on a project, but I decided to do it this time since there's a lot of inside corners and angles, and I want to be able to spray on the stain and be able to have a consistent and even access to all the surfaces. The color goes on a little finicky, and it takes a little bit of care and patience to get it all evenly applied. And then I spray on 3 coats of lacquer, but before the final coat I go over everything with some very fine steel wool to knock down any of the fuzzies. The next day, once the lacquer's dry, then it's time to glue it all up. I'm using this epoxy made for wood and not really sure how it's different than regular epoxy glue, but it claims to be a bit stronger than typical epoxy at 3770 psi strength, so I like that. With some helper blocks just to keep everything straight and square, the glue up goes pretty smooth and straightforward. And I put the top on just to hold everything in place until it's all dry. So I'm using cast acrylic for all of the panels. I bought these sheets online and then I can just cut them down to the exact size I need on the table saw, and it works great.
Alright, the only thing left to do now is put the acrylic in. Just have to take off the protective coating. Alright, and we're just going to slide it in. Hopefully all my measurements work out. So it just slides down in there. Just like that. Nice. Very nice. So about this piece of curved acrylic that goes on the front, I started with a flat piece of acrylic and heated it up and then shaped it over this form that I made. I was going to include that in this video, but the way I heated it up, it wasn't really very safe. Not something I'm particularly proud of. So I'm going to put that in a separate video, still get that up on YouTube, but with all the disclaimers, don't try this at home type of thing. So for now, let's just insert this, this piece of acrylic in here. And hopefully it'll fit. So awesome, there it goes. I'm stoked. Thanks so much for watching, and if you think I've earned it, it'd be great if you hit that thumbs up like button and consider subscribing.